Welcome everyone to our virtual town hall. We host those very, very regularly, and they tend to be very interesting conversations with great speakers. And I'll introduce today's amazing speakers in just a sec. I first wanted to quickly tell you what is going to happen. So first, I'm Colombe, I'm Atlas's co-founder, and I'll be hosting this event, and I will be asking all of your questions, the weirdest, most basic and craziest ones to Fazeela and Khalil, and we'll talk about climate justice. So, you know, Khalil is the founder of the Truth and Reconciliation Conversations, and he works on racial reconciliation. We've had many conversations about this over the years now that we've known each other. And he works all across the world to have those very, very important conversations that are not taking place and that I think are fundamental in the climate debate and topic and are too often sidelined. And Fazeela is a new friend to Atlas. We just met 2 minutes ago, but I'm sure it's going to be an incredible conversation. She's the co-founder of Wild Heart Kenya and a member of Fridays for Future MAPA, which stands for Most Affected People and Areas. And this is also extremely relevant because in today's town hall, we'll of course talk about climate, but not only. We will look at how climate and the response to climate change is impacting differently people from across the world, different countries, but also people within existing countries, based on different lines that can be race, gender, socioeconomic backgrounds, and more. And this is extremely important, especially to us at Atlas, because we work on a concept called equity, and the way the climate crisis is dealt with is not equitable. And we want to get to the bottom of it. So before jumping into the million questions I have for you, I just wanted to give a quick stat that I think came up a lot at COP26 and will help in putting this into context for people that don't necessarily realize how we deal in an unacceptable way with the climate crisis on so many levels. The first one is the combined emissions of the richest 1% of the global population account for more than the poorest 50%. And it just shows, not even talking about a governmental level or so on, how unequitable it is and how we're dealing with the climate crisis. I'm almost done speaking, I promise. Last thing to mention is, as I mentioned, we are right now on Zoom with some attendees that will be asking questions, and we are also live streaming on social media. And my team is monitoring both chats. So ask all of your questions on the chats. We'll try to answer as many as possible. Otherwise, we'll continue the conversation online afterwards. First question, I wanted to start with you, Fazeela. I wanted to know, since you're a member of Fridays for Future MAPA, how do you see the climate crisis impacting different countries across the world? What is your own experience with it?
So for me personally, I was born in Kenya. I've lived in Nairobi, and I just started volunteering with wildlife causes about 8 years ago. And what I've seen just like in the last 8 years has been really catastrophic. You know, I volunteer in an area called the Savo Conservation Area. And the very first time that I went to volunteer there, I was with the project officer. He put me, I saw how very important it was communities were taking care of the biodiversity and how they were living side by side with wildlife. But what's been happening over the years is that each and every dry season is becoming really prolonged. And when the dry seasons are prolonged, is that the water holes dry up, and it pushes wildlife outside of their natural habitat. And this is like huge elephants and buffaloes causing like extreme crisis. You know, imagine if you have a herd of 100 elephants coming to a small farm, you have the whole crops for the whole, year are just destroyed all at one go. And here we don't have a welfare system. So, it's just that little income that they depend on for their food, any extra is sold off. And you can imagine the level of poverty that keeps on increasing. So that's one of the main things that are happening right now. Also, as we speak, Kenya right now is going through a very devastating drought. We have a few rains here and there, so I'm hoping that they do keep up. But it means we have had 2 rainfalls of failed rainfalls that haven't fallen. The crops have dried out, our livestock are dying, and we're having people literally on the brink of starvation. That's a very real experience that my people are living right now.
Thank you so much for sharing this. It was actually one of my other questions is, when we talk about climate and when we look at climate, a lot of people see it as something far away that might happen in the future and not as something that is already impacting a big part of the planet and a lot of people across the world. And on this, just to also introduce Khalil, I wanted to ask you, since you work on racial reconciliation, do you see climate change and climate responses as a problem to look at through a racial lens? And I know I sent you this ahead of time, but I was reading that communities of color in the US are more often at risk, for example, of air pollution. So clearly there's a link. Can you tell us a bit more about it? You muted, sorry, you have to unmute.
One of the most important parts of this conversation for me is to understand how climate justice is at the heart of what I call intersectionality. And the intersectionality I'm talking about is how we begin to rethink the way that we have behaved in silos around our various social issues. A practical example, my organization focuses on ending racism and gender-based violence. And there are a lot of people within my own movement who don't identify themselves as activists or advocates for climate justice. Yet climate justice is at the heart of all of our conversations about equity, about how we will show up and be able to live on this planet as human beings. So the starting point for me when I think about climate justice is well beyond race. I think race in many ways does a disservice. If we think purely in racial terms about climate justice, it does a disservice to those of us who are really serious about how to broaden our conversation and in some ways become far more inclusive with our activism to address these social ills. So I understand how someone, for example, in New Orleans or in Houston, Texas, could hear the words climate change and climate justice and on the surface think that it doesn't apply to them when they see it on TV. But I promise you, when hurricane season comes and the summer comes and the rising temperatures and rising sea levels happen, there will be a clear understanding of the connection. It will be visceral. And that's happening all over the world. So this is not a case of us falling into the same trap of racializing the issue. It's understanding, yes, we are impacted differently in instances that apply to or give context to race. That said, there's something much deeper going on that we have to be reflective about and bring to this conversation.
Completely agree. So let's start then by defining what climate justice is. I think it might be helpful for the audience because we already talked about, Fazeela, you mentioned both poverty and hunger. You mentioned the fact that in Kenya, it's already impacting your daily life and the life of everyone. We talked about race and gender. I think there's also socio-economic circumstances within our own countries. And then there's a lot of other elements, I believe, like the fact that, for example, I think the G20 countries, if you look at it, which are like the 20 richest countries in the world, have provided more than $3.3 trillion in subsidies since 2015 to fossil fuels. So they are polluting and enabling the pollution more than any other actor on the planet, yet others pay the price for it, right? So there's so many elements, and that is intersectionality, but let's try to explain maybe for the audience how you both understand climate justice. What does it mean to you? Do you want to start, Khalil?
Okay, well, when we're looking at this issue in terms of climate justice, the operative word for me that connects all of us is actually not the justice part. I start with climate. And I start with climate because it's less divisive in the sense of, I'm not asking you a personal question about your ethnic struggle or your particular level of struggle or commitment to struggle. I'm asking you first, as a human being, do you live on the planet? Are you concerned about the planet? And that's the common point of connection for me. So by starting with how are all of us impacted, we then drill down and look at it when we see these racialized disproportionate impact, the case of disproportionate impact based on racialized variables. I think that the key has to be also to recognize that there is a global system of economic injustice that exists in the world. So when we talk about Kenya, South Africa, when we talk about poor cities in America, we're talking about economies. We're talking about something that in many ways is defined by class and economics, even more than race, more profoundly than race. And so I think of climate justice as the way for all of us to begin to rethink what really is the basis for our connection when we talk about the issue of justice. How does that apply? What do we bring to this discussion about justice when we recognize from the standpoint of climate, we're all impacted? And so clearly there's going to be
the same, right?
We're not impacted the same. And because we're not all impacted the same, the nuanced aspects of how this affects you personally is where we're going to oftentimes find the greatest passion and the greatest disagreement.
Okay, what about you, Fazeela? How do you understand climate justice? What does it mean to you? You muted, you need to unmute. Yeah, Zoom, I think 2 years
Sorry
in the
about
pandemic, we're all struggling with unmuting still.
Yeah, well, I just like what Khalil said, I agree on a lot of points with him. But for me, it's climate justice even comes down to some of the most basic things. Like I remember once we were doing a project on there was a really bad drought a couple of years ago, and we were working with the community scouts delivering water to the water site for the wildlife. And as they were going through, they came across a group of girls aged between 7 to 10 years old, carrying jerrycans of water, walking through the bush. And there's a danger of wildlife coming, and it's very dangerous. There's an issue of being kidnapped by militants, all these issues. And when they stopped and asked them what's happening, they said that the water holes near their homes had dried up. So they had to miss school that particular day, and they had to walk extra miles just to go and get water so that they could go back home and have something to cook and clean their houses and everything. While for somebody who lives in one of the G20 countries, they would never know what it means to miss school just for water. They would, even like we've seen the climate crisis affecting the countries like Germany and all that, they do have the infrastructure to deal with all this crisis, whilst we do not. So for me, climate justice comes down to like the very basic things. It's really heartbreaking to see, young girls missing out on schools just because of water. For me, climate justice is when girls don't have to miss out on school. Children don't have to go to bed hungry on any day, whether there's good weather or not. So for me, it's the very basic things. That's what it comes down to.
Thanks for this. So let me jump on this. You mentioned one, I think it's a very powerful way of explaining climate justice, but you also mentioned in Kenya, girls will miss out on school to get water. It's something, as you said, other countries are impacted by the climate crisis, but not the same thing happens. And I think that's very telling because, again, you mentioned the G20. The G20 countries are the countries that are the majority let me try again. Sorry, it's the end of the day and English is not my first language. The G20 countries are the countries that are the most at fault when it comes to causing the climate crisis, right? Like they emit the most. As I mentioned, they gave $3.3 trillion of subsidies since 2015 to fossil fuels. They subsidize it abroad as well. yet they pay less the price. And then we ask other countries not only to reduce their emissions, to transition, but we also don't help them financially. So what do you think, in the sense of climate justice, what do you think should be done? How can we hold them accountable, and how can we move towards a more equitable future when it comes to disparities between countries?
Well, the first thing is we need to stop all the investment on fossil fuels. That just has to stop, and we're tired of this kind of eco-fascism that happens, especially towards people of color. It's really disheartening to see, when people tell us that we're overpopulated when we, emit literally very negligible amounts of carbon into the world. And people keep pointing fingers to us that we don't recycle and all that. But when you go down to see the very basics, it's done by huge corporations that keep on polluting, and they come and dump all the rubbish to us, or all the products to us. And then it becomes our problem. You deal with it. We don't care. So there needs to be responsibility, especially from these corporations. They need to be held accountable. They need to stop polluting, and more importantly, we need reparations, and we want mitigation. Mitigation finances, because all this crisis is happening on a huge scale. Our livestock are dying, as I said. Our crops have failed. Now we're having a very bad drought. Maybe the next thing is going to be extreme rains. So that would be like another season of where people have to cope with all these disasters. We don't have the infrastructure to deal with this. So we need the resources to deal with all this crisis that we are going through.
Before I jump to Khalil, one follow-up question. So when you say reparations, so mitigation finances, I think that's clear for most people. It's like richer countries need to support less rich countries in transitioning towards greener energies and so on. Reparations, do you mean reparations from states, from the companies that polluted? Do you mean financial reparations? How do you see this?
Yeah, because some of these corporations, they've literally destroyed our whole ecosystems. Yeah. There's like, to go to see something like plastic, there's a lot of poverty within the plastic area. You have some of the biggest names in plastic corporations who are taking advantage of the waste pickers, and they live in really dehumanizing conditions that is really unacceptable.
Yeah, Khalil, do you want to tell us how you think?
Yeah, well, I think that, first of all, you're asking some really tough questions.
I know.
Colombe, and so I think it's really important that we challenge ourselves to be reflective about such tough questions, because this is the space that we don't go to. Oftentimes we stick with generalizations and glib answers, and they don't get much traction. And I'll just give a concrete example. COP26, for the first time, we actually addressed the issue, brought it to the main table about loss and damage. We've not been able as a movement to get the issue of loss and damage, which is what Fazeela is talking about, to the main table, to the main discussion for those countries, the developing countries who are suffering the most. We've really struggled to get to a point where the conversation could even be remotely close to developing countries having some influence over what the decisions are and having a sense of hope about those decisions. So what I would say is the starting point always is with examining ourselves. What is it that we can do better to change the dynamic of power structures? And one of the starting points for me is that all power starts with self-perception. All power starts with self-perception. If we continue to see ourselves as victims and powerless, that's part of the problem itself. And I'll give you a concrete example. If the leadership in many of our countries were actually conducted themselves in ways that were principled and actually acted in the best interest of all its citizens, much of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of betrayals on the continent of Africa in particular would look very different. We have to ask ourselves as Africans, as people of African descent, when we look at colonization and the divide in power, how did we get here? How did so many other corporations, how did these corporations gain such a strong foothold over our economies after liberation? I'm not talking about before liberation movements. I'm talking about post-liberation, post-colonization. And those questions have to be part of the discussion about what do we do to change it. We cannot operate in a historical vacuum. Having said that, we have to ask ourselves in each country, those of us who oppose the climate injustice, what are we doing in our local communities to be more visible, to be more vocal, and to be more active in making sure that we hold our local economies, our local leadership responsible? Because for the majority of people in the world, we're not part of the G20 conversation. We won't be at COP27 in Egypt next year, even if we live on the continent of Africa. And in fact, many Egyptians don't consider Egypt Africa. So there are serious challenges that we have that we will have to examine and begin to talk about with brutal honesty in order for us to really say that we're going to make some headway in this movement. Because quite frankly, Colombe, what I see is our movement is fragmented. When we talk about climate justice, we go around the world and we talk about climate justice. We hear everywhere you go, you hear different explanations about what it is. And you see people united about it's something we want to challenge. But when we go and drill down like we're doing today, like we're doing right now in this kind of discussion, that's where we see the greatest work needs to be done.
Yeah, it's always, the devil is in the details, right? I just want to jump on something you said. As I always felt very weirdly when I was told, especially by leaders, fighting the climate crisis starts with yourself. And I know, Khalil, you come from a perspective of self-perception and so on.
Yeah.
But for me, I've always, and that's why I was asking the question about the G20, beyond the fact that I agree, obviously, most people don't live in G20 countries and so on. I'm from France, as you can hear from my accent. France is a country that gives more subsidies to dirty fossil fuels than to the green sector. Yet, we love to pretend that our government is doing a lot. It has been held guilty of climate inaction. It's polluting all over the world. It's one of the governments highly responsible for the climate crisis and so on. But, it's on us citizens to stop the climate crisis. And that's why I actually want to get into the G20 and Fazeela, you mentioned corporations. I think 100 companies polluted like 70% of global CO2 emissions or something like this, which is insane. 100 companies are ruining the world. It's crazy. Considering that you have those centers of powers, right? Those huge governments that are so rich, so powerful, polluting so much, and 100 companies that are, pardon my language, but fucking up the entire planet, without a say. How do we achieve justice from this? And I understand the local aspect, and I understand the self-perception. I understand the historical thing, and the colonialism and racial injustice and systematic racism. I think has something to do with this. I think there's a lot of other socioeconomic elements as well. But how today do we hold the G20 and other countries responsible, but also those 100 companies to account?
Aren't we the people more numerous than they are?
Yeah.
Aren't the masses, don't we as people, the people, when I say it starts with us, the self that I'm talking about is plural. I am because we are. I recognize that we have to, the reason why I joined with you, Colombe, is because you're tackling the issue in a way that I have not had the training to do and that I have not had the education to do. So I extend our organization to partner with your organization so that the people in my organization have an opportunity to learn and grow and continue to build on the progress that we need to make collectively. And so climate justice is part of that alliance that organizationally we have to build, whether we're a grassroots organization or a global NGO. We have to align ourselves with other organizations that are doing the work that we think is important, because beyond individuals, ideas will be only pipe dreams until they're institutionalized. And organizations are that method, that process by which we do that. So what I say is join an organization fighting for climate justice like Atlas is.
Okay, amazing. And what about you, Fazeela? How do you see this?
Yeah, I just very powerful words by Khalil, and I totally agree with him that, you know, if it's just one person fighting, it's very difficult. But when we all come together and, you know, be a force and hold people accountable, then we can have real meaningful change come through.
Completely agree with that. The reason for which I'm pushing on this is, you know, with climate, we've seen so much amazing mobilization, and I think it's really been, at least for my generation, and it's been like, I've never seen so many people on the streets across the world. It's been incredible and so powerful. And you've seen this across continents, countries, different people, and so on. But it's not being translated into policies. And this is why I'm trying to brainstorm with you all and to think how we achieve not only an end to the climate crisis, but an end to climate inequity and injustice. Is we've seen, you know, at COP26, we've seen incredible leaders from taking the term of Fridays for Future and MAPA countries, from different communities coming to the front lines, coming to the stage and saying, look, we are the ones primarily impacted, we don't have the same stage, and so on. And so my next question is going to be about COP26. We've seen some progress in the sense that there's been promises and pledges, I think, of a bit more financing. It has never really met the targets in general for the history. What do you think about it? How do we ensure that the financing and all of this goes hand in hand? What did you think of the results of COP26? Whoever wants, it's a conversation, so whoever wants to go for it. Otherwise, I'll call on someone.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that the results are pretty clear. They don't get us to where we need to go to stay with the goal of 1.5 Celsius going into 2030. So we know that the end result falls short. That said, I'm the eternal optimist. I do think that a movement for climate justice does itself a disservice if it refuses to engage the establishment. And I want to be really clear about this statement, because as activists, oftentimes we end up defining ourselves more by what we're against than what we're for. And that is a huge challenge to our movement. In order for us to make great strides forward, we've got to be more clear about what we stand for, not just what we're against. And what we stand for, there are opportunities when we define that to create coalitions and relationships with partners that probably we would not have in the past. And so when I said earlier that we have just begun to talk about loss and damage, the loss and damage conversation is about massive losses to lives, land, and livelihoods. We're talking about people on the ground suffering. And Fazeela talked about the need for resources. Well, some kind of financing facility is going to happen, however textualized, however much it will be unique to a specific country, but that money is there. And we ought to be thinking about how to be effective in our accessing it and our use of it so that we leverage it for a greater good that serves as a global model of what can happen when we have the opportunity. So for me, I'm thinking, Colombe, that the delta that exists between what was promised and those so-called pledges and where we are today, the ones who will have to hold them accountable are those of us who are working with organizations like yours, because it has to be done at an organizational level globally, working with organizations like yours, being informed about who exactly to reach out to nationally and locally so that we put pressure on the right people to get the outcomes that we want. Many of us don't even know who to raise a climate justice question with at the local level. We don't know politically. So we certainly don't know at a national level. And then at a global level, what organizations are we connected with that is fighting that fight on the front line with people who are studying the issue? And Colombe, I would just say organizations like Atlas you are at the vanguard of training young activists about how to be informed and fight on this issue, not just against climate change, but for climate justice. So I think that we're both the institutional foundation for the kind of learning and activism that goes forward. But I also think that as activists, look, I'm 62, and I arrive at this conversation with an understanding that my greatest teachers are those who are much younger than me. So I'm very clear that I am in a student role in this. And being in a student role, I understand that I must do my homework. I must do the study. I must make the extra effort. So that is why I'm coming to organizations like yours. That's why I'm talking to sisters like Fazeela. That is why we're doing this work. We must understand and we must acknowledge that there's a lot of it we just don't know, Colombe. We don't know.
Sure. I think all of us. Thank you, Khalil. I think, Fazeela, can you also tell us what you think? Because you mentioned, as Khalil mentioned, resources. Can you tell us what you think of the outcomes of COP26 when it comes to reparations or just financial resources to mitigate the climate crisis? And I see a question at the same time that I'm going to link to this on Facebook, which is, what's your hope for COP27 as a result?
Yeah, well, for me, COP26 personally was very disappointing because there wasn't enough representation, especially from African countries, and especially like our indigenous people who live in rural areas. There was very little representation. I was also very, very disappointed because most of the sponsors, some of the biggest sponsors, are some of the biggest polluters of our planet, and those, which meant there's literally lots and lots of greenwashing that's been happening. So that for me, that was a really disheartening thing to see. But one thing that I was really happy was with the protests and the voices of young activists coming out together and speaking against these atrocities was very heartening to see. And as far as the finance is done, they said they will start talks, which is a step towards the right direction. But sadly, we do not have time. There's no time left. So I guess we just have to keep on pushing on and hold, like Khalil said, hold our leaders accountable from the very basic local level to the highest up.
Yeah, and push for more money, right? Faster.
Yeah.
Instead of pledges that never come through. I'm gonna pick, sorry, I have a few questions from social media. I still have so many questions and we don't have forever. So I'm gonna pick a question from Anita, who is a volunteer working on a campaign to ban fossil fuel subsidies. She's asking, how can we people in the global north give more voice to MAPA, for instance, in addition to have events like this? And how can we make our governments, known for always prioritizing their direct electorates, act for all of us in a broader sense? It feels like too broad of a goal for politicians to buy into it very often. And I think that's linked to what you were saying, Fazeela, I've been watching and so on. How do we ensure that, when our governments, I always say that climate is very sexy, at least in Europe, before the election. It's the sexiest topic. Like, you talk about climate, talk about it over and over and over again. You even take pictures and post them as a politician, and then nothing happens anymore. And when it does, it's super linked to the national level, but it doesn't consider whatsoever the broader. So a lot of countries, for example, ban fossil fuel subsidies in their country, but they still finance it elsewhere. How can we give a broader voice?
I feel like this is one of the steps, because like actually listening to us, most of the time we have people speaking on our behalf and then calling us voiceless. We're not voiceless, we have our own voices. So pass the mic. When you have this events like conferences and all that, acknowledge us and give us the space to speak. Do not speak on our behalf. Sadly, like I've been to a couple of protests and all that, and because I'm a person of color and because I wear the hijab, I'm cropped out, even though I've been there for like a couple of hours. But when one prominent person comes, all the focus goes on them and we're all left out. So don't do that, whether you're the media or all that. We are all a part of it and we are very much there. I just had a thought the other day that I was feeling really down about how we're always erased. I went to a protest recently, and I did a couple of interviews with some of the biggest media organizations, but they never made it to the media, maybe because I did not fit the shoe of what a climate activist should be. But that's very disheartening, because it means that they don't, the media always tries and picks up whatever fits their agenda. So if you see that happening, please use your privilege to call that out. And as much as there's like a literal erasure of our voices and of our existence, our very existence is a rebellion in itself. So you can try and erase us, but we'll always be there. So if you're in a position of privilege, always speak out and hold your leaders and all stakeholders accountable.
So you're on mute, Colombe. Yeah.
I did it as well. I was going to say my next question for you both before passing the mic to Khalil was going to be what's your call to action to activists. So I think that's very clear. Use your position of privilege to actually, not give a voice, but enable people concerned to speak instead of just speaking itself. Khalil, do you want to answer to Anita's question as well?
Yeah, well, I just want to say that at a very practical level, what we're doing within our organization is we're launching a campaign. We have launched a campaign to increase youth participation in 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. We understand that climate injustice disproportionately impacts women and girls. And because we recognize that, we understand that it's vital for us to support the movement to challenge violence against women and girls in all of its forms. And climate justice is part of that conversation. So we should be asking ourselves, how do we organize better? How do we support each other better? When I hear Fazeela say, make comments like being erased and having been there for 2 hours and speaking to top media outlets, and then when the report is done, because you don't look like the profile of what a climate activist is to you in your Northern European, Northern American model, you look at people, a woman in a hijab, and say, no, this is not the activist that we're looking for to inspire people in America, in North America, or in Canada, or in the UK. We know that's happening. We see that happening. We experience it and we bleed it. So when I talk about the need for us to do a better job at organizing within our own ranks, I'm saying, let's start with the power we do have. And that is, you have used Atlas to create a platform that's globally viewed. So now, Fazeela, the people who didn't show your interview today, guess what? All of those people who missed it have an opportunity to hear and see you in your own words in the most beautiful way that you've shown up, because we have a partner organization called Atlas that decides to go outside the stereotypical frames for what climate justice looks like and what it means. So that is why I'm saying that we must remind ourselves of the power we do have. And as Hannibal said, we will either find a way or we will create a new one.
I think both your interventions are beautiful. I love that we will either find a way or create a new one. I think we definitely need to create 100 new ones, considering how it's going and the fact that no leader is meeting their pledges and that climate justice still isn't on top of the agenda. And when it is, it concerns a very specific group and not injustice at large. And just to quickly recap, because I have a question looking at the future. So far, we talked about climate injustice when it comes to injustice between countries, so certain countries polluting more and other countries paying the price. We talked about it when it comes to women and girls who predominantly pay the price, as Khalil said. We talked about it when it comes to racial lines as well, as some stats that I've mentioned in the US. And we talked about it when it comes to poverty, as Fazeela mentioned as well, with some people having to decide between education and survival. And all of those exist at the global level and within countries, right? So it's understanding, as you said, Khalil, the intersectionality of all of those issues and how to deal with them systematically from the local to the global level. And I feel like often, even though it's never properly dealt with, local in a way is you see it happening more in front of your eyes. Global, it's easy to focus on the beautiful greenwashing speech of whoever is doing it at the moment and wanting to make themselves feel good. I think there's something we didn't talk about. It's generational. So Khalil, you hinted at it because you mentioned your age and the fact that you're learning as a result. But when we look at the climate crisis, the truth is us and future generations will be the ones paying the price, right? Like higher than, and already it will depend based on different characteristics, but we will pay a higher price. And yet our interests are less considered. And let me just expand on this 1 second. You look at it through the climate movement, a lot of people have called to lower the voting age to 16. I've read an article, I think a few weeks ago, calling to lower the voting age to 6. So there's a lot of proposals across the world on how to consider future interests. And there are other examples of governments trying to take into account the needs of future generations. For example, Wales has a future generation commissioner, and her role is to look at, in every bill that passes, in every law that passes, to look at the interests of future generations. I think it's something that's missing a lot from this discourse, right? And in policymaking in general. How do you suggest, from what you're seeing around you, we take into account not only the missed opportunities that future generations will have because of the climate crisis and the climate injustice, but their very survival? Go for it, Khalil.
Yeah, those are like very interesting questions. And yeah, they are the ones who are going to suffer the most. They're going to pay the price of the climate crisis. Literally, we're seeing it happening right now. And there needs to be more participation because, especially in countries like ours, especially African countries, you see the decision makers is mostly, the older generation. And what happens sadly is because of corruption, everybody is just interested in generating their own wealth for their future, for their children as well. So that's what they care about their lineage. But I totally agree with you, and I'm so happy that Wales has started just saying that they're trying to look at these policies in place, especially for the younger generation. So I'm really hopeful, which is a word that's being used a lot these days. And you see everything happening. It's hard to keep up that hope, but it's something that we cling on to. And yeah, that's what we hold on to, and we look forward to where there's more youthful participation, because that's where all the innovation is. That's where the future is. Not even the future, even right now. We're seeing the new generations that coming into the workplace. There's massive changes, and it's something that we can look up to. That's all I have to say.
Well, look, let me just say, I think what you're suggesting, Fazeela, and Colombe, what you have outlined, what you have framed so brilliantly, is that future generations are going to be confronted with this issue far more profoundly and immediately in terms of the decisions that they have to make than the ones we're making now. So as urgent as we're saying it is, our generation has no clue what the next generation will have to decide about how to handle this situation. So here's what I'd like to kind of end this with. There was a brilliant author whose work I've studied for many years named Frantz Fanon. And he said, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. What I'm confident in and confident of is that the generations to come, as long as I'm doing what I need to do right now in this generation, in this time, of providing as much information and doing as much in the interest of climate justice as I humanly can, and the way that I show up as an example of how to work in a principled and transparent and inclusive way with other organizations and other people different than yourself, different than I am, as long as I continue to provide that kind of clear example, that future generations will one day be able to examine under a microscope of forensic information, and that is to say information beyond anything that I can imagine right now, because the way they're collecting data today is nothing like I imagined in my lifetime. So I'm convinced that future generations are going to come up with solutions that I can't imagine at this moment. And I'm convinced that they will discover their mission out of the relative obscurity, and rather than betray it, like you today, Colombe, like you today, Fazeela, like I am making every effort to do, they will fulfill their mission, and they will find answers to climate justice that we haven't conceived of. Our role is to do what is within our reach to make sure that we provide the clearest possible example of what climate justice looks like personally, at a community level, and at a global level.
I think that's a perfect way of closing it. And to link both of what you said together, I think, Fazeela, at the beginning, you mentioned representation and representation in politics at the beginning of your last answer. And I think this is something fundamental. You know, we talked about the G20. I saw the G20 pictures before COP26, which pissed me off so badly. It was, I think, like out of 20 countries, there were, I think, 2 or 3 female heads of states. And we mentioned how you mentioned a lot gender-based violence, Khalil, and how climate impacts primarily women and girls. Well, again, who knows better how to deal with issues concerning women and girls than women and girls, yet they're not in power. And I think it's the same along so many lines. And in thinking about future generations, we need youth representation. We need youth interest to be considered, because we can't wait until the youth is old enough to be able to promote their interests via political participation. It will be too late. And so we need real representation. Thank you both so much for joining me for this hour. It was amazing to speak together. For everyone involved, I know there were more questions that I didn't get to ask, but I'm sure that if you tweet, Instagram, Facebook, or whatever you use at Fazeela and Khalil, they'd be happy to answer. And I also want to point to the fact that we have been working on a campaign to ban fossil fuel subsidies. Andrea and Zoe will be sharing the link on Facebook and on Zoom. Let me just say what it is. Fossil fuels are bad. And fossil fuel subsidies are even more bad. So to make it very clear, 89% of global CO2 emissions come from the fossil fuel industry, and we gave an enormous amount of money to this industry to pollute more and destroy more the planet. This has to stop. It has to end. And so we are raising awareness for a petition, and then we're not just screaming and being annoying about it, which we love to do. but we are also then starting national campaigns in Kenya, Australia, Italy, and Germany so far, and Mexico, I think, to use participatory tools like referendums, national petitions in front of parliaments, lobbying petitions, and so on, to make sure that this happens in the law in different countries across the world. So please, please, please click on the link that you see popping up everywhere at this very moment, sign, support the work, and then go and follow Khalil and Fazeela for their amazing work on racial reconciliation and gender-based violence for Khalil, and on conservation and climate change for Fazeela. Thank you so much both for joining me. It was amazing.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll talk soon.
Yes.
Soon, yes. Bye.
Bye.